between ERNICA members. For the near future, we aim to stimulate our partners actually, to make consortia on research topics for potential calls in the future, which probably is getting more and more important to have an international network. Next slide, please. To gain insight in the research work performed by ERNICA members, we organized the ERNICA Research Survey, and this resulted in a large file with information on the many different projects performed in Europe. Next slide. As scientific committee, we pooled the results we gained and reviewed the results and categorized them among 4 different themes, which are research on the origin, intervention, impact, and comorbidity. As you can see, this is a small snapshot of our file, and what you can see there are 4 different colors, which all refer to a specific category. Next slide. Currently, we know from many European centers what type of research they're performing, and we try to facilitate a collaboration between these centers. And this webinar is an attempt to further stimulate the collaboration. Therefore, the goal is to exchange experiences on performing international clinical trials. Everybody who is performing international trials is probably aware of the difficulties involved in it. We want to offer the opportunity to you to learn from each other and to share everybody's ideas and tips. At the end, we hope you can have a lively discussion. Next slide, please. Therefore, I'm very pleased that I can announce the first speaker, which is Anne-Fleur van Hal. Anne-Fleur is a PhD student in Rotterdam under the supervision of René Wijnen and Dr. Vlot. And her research focuses on esophageal atresia in relation to different aspects influence the patient's life. In her presentation, she will address issues in performing an international trial on refractory structures in patients with esophageal cancer. And hopefully we can learn a lot from all her success and maybe difficulties in performing this research. Anne-Fleur, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I am going to try and show my screen. Let me see if it works this time. Yes, that's what I was afraid of.
I think just push on the button again on top.
On top, yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Now
Perfect.
It's working, right?
Looks great.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it? All right, sorry. Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you all for joining. I will give a short introduction on the STEP-CA trial and tell you about the difficulties we experienced and the lessons that we have learned. So the STEP-CA trial stands for intralesional steroid injections to prevent refractory strictures in patients with esophageal atresia. And what we do in this trial is one-on-one randomization to injection with quinacort prior to balloon dilatation and balloon dilatation without any injection in order to prevent a refractory stricture after esophageal atresia correction. With this trial, we have 3 main objectives, which are the effectiveness, the safety, and the cost effectiveness. Setting up this trial has taken some time, and the first idea for the STEPS trial was brought up in May 2017, and eventually in January 2019, the ethical board gave permission to start the trial. And a few months later, in October, the first patient was included and the first participating center was ready, which was Helsinki. This same year, a grant was awarded, making it possible for other centers to join and give the trial a real go. And the second inclusion came more than a year after the first inclusion. And this was not only because of the pandemic, but it was also because it's just a rare disease. And less than a month ago, the 5th and the 6th center received ethical approval, which were Lund and Stockholm in Sweden. And they will probably be ready to start the trial in the upcoming next weeks. And exactly 4 years after the ethical approval in Rotterdam has been obtained, we have been able to include the 11th patient today, which means we are 4 years later now, and that means it's will be, and it is, a long journey. And in the next few slides, I will show you what it is that takes so long and what you can do to improve in your next trial. So as mentioned, when setting up the trial back in 2017, consensus on the protocol needed to be reached. And as the pediatric surgery was not the only department involved, in order to set up the trial, we needed to discuss with the pediatrics, the gastroenterology, the pharmacy, the endocrinology, the radiology, and more departments. This eventually took more than 1.5 years to reach consensus on the protocol, and therefore we would like to advise you, though it might be difficult to logistically plan, organize an away day with all the people involved to keep yourself from constantly emailing back and forth for more than a year. And so after the protocol was written, what are the rules you'll have to follow? So as mentioned, this is an international multicenter randomized controlled trial using corticosteroids, which means the clinical trial, it's a clinical trial with a medicinal product. And we have young children in the trial, which means stricter regulations. And because of these stricter regulations, we chose not to include patients younger than 3 months, even though this means we miss a few of the already rare patients. And lastly, we have an additional esophagram exposing the children to an extra radiation. So this altogether means we have to apply for ethical approval within the Medical Review Ethics Committee. And because it was a Rotterdam initiated study, our METC in Rotterdam was going to have a look at the paperwork. And after they approved, all the participating centers in the Netherlands would be able to join the trial, after receiving local approval in their hospital, of course. And as mentioned earlier, it's a medicinal study, meaning that the Central Committee on Research involving human subjects need to give positive advice after ethical approval from the METC. So the ethical approval from the ethical board is the biggest task, and I'm sure you're all aware of the most documents needed for the approval, and a few documents took some more time or are really study specific. For instance, as previously mentioned, this is a medicinal study, and therefore the uterus CT is mandatory. This is a European database registering all drug trials. And when submitting for the ethical approval in Rotterdam, we made sure to have the subject insurance ready for all patients to be included in the Netherlands, and the liability insurance is covered by the Erasmus MC. And sometimes something that makes a lot of extra time is finding the committee members for the Data Safety Monitoring Board. And this is something that is not mandatory in the Netherlands, but highly recommended, especially for a trial like this one, which has a moderate risk. And the board members should be from different hospitals, and they are therefore not involved in the trial or within the hospital. And it can be quite tricky to find the right people who are willing to join the board, and some even ask a fee in return. So this is something to keep in mind before starting the trial and for your own future trial. What we also needed to have was the application. For the application was an advice from the radiation committee for the X-ray esophagram performed during the trial. And then after the ethical approval was obtained in Rotterdam, we needed to make sure that all the documents are ready for the participating centers, which also means the contracts that need to be signed. Before being able to send all the documents to a center who wants to participate, you have to ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement. And this one is mostly signed pretty fast. However, the CTA tends to take way more time, and this is namely because we need to talk about money, and this can take very long. With one center, it even took us almost 2 years to get through on the CTA, and after that, it was only possible to start the ethical approval. And with other centers, we can count on at least a few weeks or even months. So as previously mentioned, we have received a grant, and this enables us to give the participating centers 750 euros for each included patient. And with these 750 euros, we expected to be able to, for the centers to cover the costs for a research nurse, for the pharmacy, extra visit to the outpatient clinic, additional esophagram, and travel costs for the patient. However, what we did not notice, or what we didn't include, was the money needed for insurance. Somebody still has their mic unmuted. Thank you. So for the insurances, the legal department, the ethical approval, and the pharmacy, those costs were not covered, of course, with the 750 euro for each patient, because to start with the ethical approval, that can already cost easily 2,000 euros or even more. Then we had the translations, and the other translations than the standard ones were not foreseen in the costs. And some translation agencies can ask a lot of money, especially when you want them to translate medical documents. And because of the small amount of patients, the expenses are very high for each included patient, because it doesn't matter with an ethical board if you're applying for a study which is going to include 500 patients or a study that's going to include 10 patients. And in our case, centers will probably not exceed 10 included patients. So it's really expensive for the amount of inclusions. So the fact that esophageal atresia is a rare disease is one of the study-specific difficulties. The amount of time and money to join the trial is rather big compared to the amount of patients possibly included. And the Kinacort A10, which is not available on the market in every country, in the right size of ampoules or the same dilutions, that sometimes is a bit of a tricky question. And when starting up the trial, we thought the centers would have to let the documents pass the legal department and apply for ethical approval. However, most centers also need to submit the documents to the medicinal agency. And not in every country the same rules apply. For instance, Sweden needs to apply for a biobank approval, as we ask them to cut a piece of hair after 6 months of follow-up. So this is some extra work for the people, for the centers, and the insurances are not the same everywhere. For example, Denmark, they didn't need to apply for any insurances, as the government and the hospitals already have a liability insurance and a subject insurance for every doctor or patient, whether they participate in a study or that it's just the normal clinic. So even I state some differences on this slide. The aim of every country is, I think, the same, and that is to make sure the trials are safe and doable for the patients. And that's why it can be difficult to do the same administrative procedure over and over again. However, there might be a solution. So unfortunately for the STEP-CA trial, we started too early to have the benefits of the CTIS system. But hopefully it will help the international trials with the amount of work and enable a more efficient way of collaborating, because it can be tough. And what we see with the ERNICA centers is that the centers with a research nurse or a PhD candidate are more likely to get through the ethical board and the legal department compared to centers where the full-time clinicians need to take the responsibility for the trial. And even though we have a lot of patients, as in patients in time, not in patients, the patients themselves, we must not forget how valuable this network is, and that is a network with lots of potential, and that we're in a unique position because there's barely level 1 evidence for rare diseases, which is understandable, but it's unfortunate. And I think without such trials, we will not make any huge steps for the patients and their caregivers. So we must hold on tight, I think, because as you can see, after the COVID pandemic has come to ease, more patients were able to be included, and now more centers will be joining, as you can see. And we think the inclusions will only continue to grow, even exponentially. So to summarize, what we have learned during the trial is that you need to expect higher expenses than calculated. And even when you think you're expecting higher expenses, expect even more. and expect longer duration than calculated, which concludes to the manpower planning and finances, which you really should think through before starting a trial. Just make sure you have a plan B. And a central coordinator and a local researcher who takes ownership is very important, and an important key factor, I think, for success. And eventually, it's definitely worth the effort. I think we can all be very happy if we find solutions for problems where we all, which we all see during the clinics. So I think it's important to work together and organize such webinars as this to exchange ideas. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Roel, do you want me to go on to announce the second speaker? Because I think we will have a discussion in the end. I already have a lot of questions for Anna, but I guess we discuss in the end, right?
Yeah, let's do that, if that's okay with Anne-Fleur.
Yeah, I think
yeah,
that
would
be maybe the best. Okay, so the second speaker of this afternoon session is Omid Madadi-Samyani. He's attending surgeon at Hanover Medical School, studied medicine in Marburg, Rostock, and Lübeck, and started his ped surgery training 2014 with Benno Uhre. Then did a surgical residency in Gehrden and Münster, including a 6-month clinical fellowship in hepatobiliary surgery at the liver transplant surgery unit at the NHS Royal Free Hospital in London with Professor Pollock. And he's boarded both for general surgery and pediatric surgery. On the scientific side, he's very active. He's PI of several studies, including being the co-PI of the MUCFIRE trial that he will talk about today, which is funded by the German Research Foundation with 1.5 million euro. And this study, this MUCFIRE trial, is also the topic of his talk today, and in particular, Omid, what challenges we both face, because I'm co-PI on this study, and it has been a great collaboration since then. So Omid, it's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much, Roel, for the opportunity to talk today about the challenges we faced and the difficulties with the MUCFIRE trial. I hope everybody can see the screen. And as I want to start, maybe I can just use it as an introduction. Martin already said I started my surgical career in 2014, and you will see a timeline. We started MUCFIRE in 2014, so it accompanies me through my whole career. And that's why I'm quite emotional and enthusiastic about the studies. So what is MUCFIRE? Just a very short introduction on that. It is a mucus fistula refeeding trial, and the aim is to assess the effects of the mucus fistula refeeding. And the model is a multi-center international prospective randomized trial. And you see that it is registered on clinicaltrials.gov, and you're more than free to see what our primary and secondary endpoints are in fact, but it is as simple as it sounds. We're observing and investigating the effect of the mucus fistula refeeding. And it's sometimes, as it is, research is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought. And it's not that simple, because a lot of authors, a lot of researchers have talked about the option of conducting a prospective trial on the mucus fistula refeeding, but not yet applied. So the study started with an idea in 2014. We were on a NICU ward round. We had a preterm neck infant undergoing laparotomy and ileostomy, and the question was, should we start mucus fistula refeeding? The most important question in clinical and scientific practice is, what's the evidence? So we conducted a small review, and we've seen that there were at that time 12 reports, all of them retrospective, however, numerous practical guidelines based on eminence. So there were no prospective trials, and that's what got our attention. So it was that we had the idea, let's fill the gap with some evidence, and let's conduct a prospective clinical trial. And as soon as Martin and I reviewed our own medical records, we had to revise that. We said, okay, let's conduct a prospective multi-center randomized trial, because the patient numbers are one of the most important aspects about it. And as a young and quite idealistic and naive surgeon, I thought having an idea would result in a publication maybe 3 to 4 years afterwards. But that's not realistic. So optimistic would have been to say, okay, we have the idea and we work on the ethics and everything, and within 1 year to 2 year times, we have some sort of idea how we want to conduct this study. And the reality was that it took us approximately 2 years, 2.5 years to get to the point where we had the first ethics approval. And it's quite important to emphasize it was the first one. There was a lot more to come. And that's one of the most important things. Patience. We already heard from Anne that will take time, and this was one of the first lessons I was taught during the process, or Martin and I, that you have to have patience in the work, especially when you want to conduct a prospective trial, because the timeline took us a lot of time. It was a lot different. So we had back in 2014 numerous meetings discussing the idea. We had numerous meetings discussing the first protocol versions. And then we had, in fact, numerous meetings with our statisticians to take a look at the endpoints we wanted to observe. So I have to conclude we had more than 100 meetings in 18-month time. And that wasn't the end, because one of the first aspects we learned is you need to find the right partners. We heard from Anne as well. So it's not only the partners you need in the hospital, it's the partners you need in the office. So we had a good team of neonatologists, dietitians, and the stoma team supporting us in the first steps. But we needed the statisticians, the methodologists, and the quality monitors to get on the next level. And this was what took us the first month and years of the study. So we continued observing the first thing we wanted to complete was the primary endpoint. And again, we conducted a literature review and we reviewed our own medical records. And all studies had one thing in common. The primary endpoint was the weight gained during the process of mucus fistula refeeding. And when we had the discussions, especially with the statisticians and the methodologists, got to the results. In those kind of endpoints, you have a lot of confounders that make problems as soon as you want to take on the results. So the confounders can be as simple as it gets: the scale, the daytime, the clothing, and the edema. But these are things when you're conducting a study and when you're working on the first protocol versions that you have to take and you have to think about when you want to get into the next steps. So we had to continue with our meetings on the ideas and include some of our colleagues. And in the end, we concluded that the enteral feeding with a very standardized protocol on the feeding could be a good measure in the end, especially after reviewing our enteral feeding protocols. And there was a next study conducted in our neonatology department. So we had a very standardized protocol and the estimated effect worked. So we concluded that the hypothesis of the study would be mucus fistula refeeding reduces the time to full enteral feeds after enterostomy closure based on the kilocalories of the enteral feeding on the body weight in 24 hours. So at that time point, our checklist was quite green. We had quite strict protocol, standardized protocol for the type of surgery, for the perioperative management, drug A, antibiotic for the duration of B. So we had a lot of things fixed, especially the mucus fistula refeeding protocol and the enteral nutrition protocol. And we said, okay, we have the partners in Hanover at that time point. We have a primary endpoint that we all agreed on. We had a first protocol version. And in 2016, we had the first ethics approval from Hanover. But from there on, it somehow got difficult because parallel timelines started. And the first one was in the process of the ethics application, we wanted to keep on working. So we had to do some amendments until we get the approval. And so we were about to find partners, collaborating centers. And I remember especially Martin had a lot to do. I think more than 50 phone calls, several meetings during the conferences in Congress, national and international. And in the end, we had 11 centers agreeing to participate. However, you need money because it's getting really, really expensive if you're conducting a prospective multi-center trial. So we needed a grant application. That's not that simple because we wrote 12 months the application process, writing it. And it took 15 months for the decision. And we got to know that the quality monitoring is the most expensive aspect. So 80% of our budget, and you will see the numbers later on, are for the quality monitoring. And at that point, you would say, okay, you have the money, you have the partners. So the worst part probably is finished. Not yet, because you have to accept your new reality, even if it's less good than the one you had before. Because Martin and I had to accept that before that probably we were surgeons and to somehow clinical scientists, and now we have become economists because we had to talk a lot about money and to share the money. So this was a lesson I had to learn very early, because in the end we had a grant approved, 800,000 euros by the German Research Foundation, one of the most important grant foundations in Germany. And the first study period was fixed for 3 years, 2018 to 21. And again, I have to tell you, the study didn't start there, because at that point we had the centers agreeing to participate, but we didn't have the center recruitment yet. So we had to do the pre-study visits, visiting all of those centers, talking to the pediatric surgeons, not only the pediatric surgeons, but also the neonatologists. We had a lot of protocol discussions. And then again, I have to tell you, we couldn't start the study yet, because you get to the point where you have to discuss the protocol. You had to agree on a standardized protocol. And the most common problems were the surgical protocol and the perioperative management protocol. And I would say there is no sure firm formula but for success, but there is for failure. Try to please everybody, because at that time point, to some degree, you have to get into conflicts. You cannot accept everything from the centers, and it's quite difficult to balance, because you have to keep everybody on board. You have to keep everybody motivated. So taking a look at the protocol amendments, we had the first ethics approval in Hanover, 2016. Next one, the first amendment, 18, the second amendment, 19, and then we already had the third one. And I have to tell you, it's not the final one, because we are already working on the fourth and hopefully final amendment for this year. And we have the first ethics approval for that, because this is quite important. Every amendment in a multi-center trial needs ethics approval from the study centers participating. So you have to acknowledge that studies are a dynamic process. You are not finished with this first protocol version, and this was a very important lesson: the adaptability and the dynamics of a study. So the protocol amendments included amendments of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, because a lot of centers participating were centers for congenital heart diseases and congenital heart surgery. So we had a lot of problems for our enteral feeding protocol, the standardized one, for the patients with cardiac necks, for example. One of the inclusion criteria is children less than 12 months of age, and you would agree that a preterm infant or an extremely preterm infant needs more kilocalories than the term infant with an ostomy. So we had to work on the primary endpoint and further stratify for the cohort, this heterogeneous cohort that we're working with. And in addition, we had amendments for the secondary endpoints, and in the end also for the definition of adverse events, what's quite important in such a study. So now after 7 to 8 years, I can tell you, okay, the checklist now is most likely green. So we have the partners, the final protocol, the ethics approvals, and the grants that we can work with. And that's the study overview. And taking a look at it, it looks quite complicated, because you have the course of the study, you have the overall information, several inclusion and exclusion criteria, the stratifications for the primary and secondary endpoints, and talking facts. We have 13 inclusion and exclusion criteria. We have more than 12 endpoints. We have more than 5 standard operating procedures, SOPs. And if you have a patient recruited, you have daily documentations in an electronic CRF. So increasing protocol complexity negatively impacts the patient recruitment. That's something that you have to accept, and that's something that I learned during the process, because it's not only the recruitment, but also if you have recruited a patient, get them to stick to the protocol, because what's most important is all those data, all those aspects regarding the endpoints have to be protocoled, and you need them in the ECRF for the results and the analysis in the end. So the power analysis said we need a total of 120 patients, 60 versus 60. We had 11 centers, and based on the numbers that the centers gave us, the estimated patient numbers per year, we had 201 patients expected for screening in 48 months. So 3 patients per center per year. And I think we get to the reality check. Did we end the study successfully in 2022? We would have, based on those numbers. That's the reality. You see the blue line, that's the actual recruitment line. And you see that we are lacking, that we're far behind the numbers that we expected at this time point. Still, I have to say we have added some over the last week, so we have now 62 patients. That's quite a good number for those diseases. So we still need some time. And just because you made a good plan doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. So you have to, again, get to the adaptability. And I think that's a very, very great lesson. The great thing about new friends is that they bring new energy. So this is something you always have to consider in the study. You will always have some participating center lacking behind the recruitment numbers that they promised to bring into the study. So at that time points, you have to think of recruiting new centers. And that was the reality of the MOOC5 study. So we had 6 centers already excluded during the study period because we already spent a lot of money in those centers. We had 5 new centers included, and we started European collaborations. We had esteemed colleagues from Austria, from Vienna and Graz that we're quite happy to have in the study. And currently we're working on Amsterdam and Rotterdam to have them starting to recruit patients in 2023, early 2023. And we're quite happy that we received a second funding period, adding another 500,000 euros to the money that we're already working with. So we are working now with a total of more than 1.2, close to 1.5 million euros. So currently we have 12 centers, half times reached, more than 60 patients, and we hope that we have the last patient in, again, quite optimistic, in 2024, at least in 2025. There is no I in team. This is a very, very important aspect because the most important thing is keeping your partners motivated. And you have to think of a plan for the motivation of the centers. So we work with regular newsletters, keep everybody updated. We are in regular contact with the centers, especially if we see that the recruitment numbers are going behind or decreasing. So we ask if there's anything we can help with. We have annual investigator meetings, and we're really, really happy that we started the in-person meetings again in 2022 after COVID. And we have recruitment fees and the co-authorships. But I think one more thing that is a great motivation is the option of sub-studies. So we're offering the network of those centers, and everybody is able to give some ideas if they are not included in the primary and secondary endpoints. So this is something that motivated the centers as well. And the lessons learned, we talked about the patience you need during protocol, the amendments, the ethics, the grants, the resilience. You need to quickly recover from difficulties because you will face a lot of them already early in the study period. Compromise, you need to find a middle path, especially regarding the protocols. You cannot make everybody happy, but still you need to find a way to have everybody motivated. And adaptability. Studies are dynamic processes. There is a lot of things you will learn during the process of the study. So protocol amendments are something you definitely have to plan with. So keep it simple as possible, especially the endpoints. You need to rethink plans during the process, and recruitment as the one most important aspect. Think about in and exclusion of centers. You have to always think that you need this energy and the dynamic process also with the recruiting centers. And I think that's something, motivation, keep everybody motivated and encourage the participants. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a lot. Thank you.
Omid, thank you very much for your clear presentation with a lot of pitfalls and problems you experienced. So hopefully we can increase the recruitment of your trial, but we'll discuss that later on. Hopefully Monique is also available now. Monique, can you say something so we can hear you?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you, so probably everybody can. Okay,
and
well,
I can maybe I now can I turn off the camera or turn on the camera? I'm not sure whether it is working. Otherwise, you have to do it. Well, you did see a picture of me, but I have some assistance of my lovely daughter. Okay.
Okay. Well, let me introduce you.
Let's leave it like it is. Yeah. And I will share my presentation, or will you?
Whatever you like. Do you have it, Carlos?
I have it ready. So if it doesn't work, then I can switch to my screen.
I have a button, change presenter. Do I have to click on it?
Yes.
but I can't, I'm not in the list for the change presenter. So Carlos, if you could do it for me, that would be very nice, because I can't select myself.
Okay, well, let me give you a small update on who you are, Monique. Monique is a special advisor at the Central Committee on Research involving human subjects in the Netherlands. And she's been highly involved in the introduction of the European clinical trial regulation, and I think that was in 2021. So I'm very happy that you will share your insights on the trial regulation, and hopefully you can explain to us how it impacts clinical research, and maybe you have some tips for us how to have it more easy done. Aware that you're speaking mainly on medicine research, but I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So thank you for your attendance.
Yeah, well, thank you for these nice words. Yeah, I think I have about 10 to 15 minutes to tell you something about the EU clinical trial regulation, and I did see that Anne Fleur already knows something about it, and yeah, 10 to 5 minutes is really too short, and Anne Fleur expressed some hope for improvement with the EU clinical trial regulation. Well, we have to see. So I have more focusing on why do we have a clinical trial regulation? What does it mean, a regulation? And I try to focus a little bit on the risk proportionate approaches, which might be of interest for you group as investigators. And there's a lot to say about it, and I'm willing to say something, but today is not the time. So well, it can be the time or we don't have the time. So please, next slide. First of all, I wanted to explain for the one who don't know the difference between a regulation and a directive, because up till now we are most of the times acquainted with directives where national legislation can give its own touch. But with the regulation, it's Brussels who dictates the rules. And there is less room for adaptations on a national level, and it has advantages and disadvantages. So we do see lately coming more regulations from Brussels. You probably know the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This is the clinical trial regulation. It's about clinical trial with medicinal products. This year we had the regulation on the in vitro diagnostics, and last year we also have the regulation on medical devices. So now I will focus on the regulation for clinical trials with medicinal products. Next slide. So why a regulation? Well, one of the things was that well, okay, previous one, please. It goes a little bit too fast. Previous. Well, it was seen that there was a large decrease in the number of clinical trials among the European Union. And the reasons was that the costs from studies were increasing, the start of the studies were delaying, and there was no harmonization between member states. So what can be an advantage of a clinical trial regulation? Harmonization between member states. Okay, next one. But another important purpose was also to foster innovation and research in the European Union, so to have more clinical trials, a faster startup, and a faster assessment procedure. And also there was a need to facilitate larger clinical trials cross-border. So not only small national clinical trials, but work together and have multinational clinical trials. Well, the key benefits of the regulation is that, yeah, there will be better information sharing, and there will be a collective decision making, because it's now not the clinical trials which take place in more than one member state will be assessed together with the member states. So it's not an assessment procedure per member state, but there will be one member state in the lead, and together with the input from the other member states, there will be a conclusion. And it will, one of the other objectives is to be more transparent on clinical trials. I will tell you a little bit later, and I can't see it on the slide, but the last one is again the harmonization among member states. Next slide, please. Yeah, you have to click once, and I think, yeah, so just to summarize, it is to foster innovation, harmonization, next, to be more efficient, and the last one is again the transparency. Next one. How will we do it? Please click. I was not aware that I had this. So there will be one single portal for submissions and notifications of clinical trials, and this portal is named CTIS, Clinical Trial Information System. And the big advantage is that there is one application dossier. So during previous time, you had to have an application dossier for every member state. Now you only need one central part where you have your protocol, your product information, information about the medicinal product which you want to administer. And there is also a national part too, obvious I would say, because if you have an information letter for the potential trial participants, that has to be of course in the language of that member state. There are different rules with respect to insurance, but also the assessment of the clinical trial site, if they are feasible to conduct, the investigators are being assessed. That is all on a national level. So that will be a national part 2 and a central part 1, but it will all be submitted at this one single portal. In the regulation, it's mentioned strict timelines for every step in the process. So from the start, the trial has been submitted, the time, the tick is clocking, I have to say, and the trial will be validated with a certain timeline. If there are questions for the investigator will be given a certain timeline, and so on and so on. And these timelines are very strict. If you don't manage to address certain issues within a specific timelines, the application can lapse. In certain times there can even be a tacit approval, yeah, you really have to take into account those timelines. This was all done to speed up the process, but it can be challenging, especially for sponsors. They do have a relatively short time period to respond on questions from the regulators or ethics, and that is in most cases only 12 days, 10 to 12 days, depending on the phase you are. Next, please. Click, that's another one. And I just said it's a central coordinated assessment. So this central part will be assessed together with other member states. And this is really an advantage of this new system, I have to say. So next one. And the regulation does know some risk proportionate approaches. And for instance, the low intervention clinical trials. And that might be of interest, I think, for the scope you are working in, if I understand correctly, because you are investigating of comparing standard of cares, different standard of cares between hospitals or between countries, and try to find out what is the best standard of care. So, and this falls a little bit in this category of low intervention clinical trials. What we do have to realize that the European Commission finds it very important that we will be more transparent about clinical trials performed in the European Union. So almost everything what is submitted in this EU portal system, the CTIS system, will be made public at some point in time. The only thing which will not be made public is information what is considered commercial confidential information or personal data. This will not be made public, and there are specific rules on that. It's for another time, just for you to know. Next slide, please. So the scope is important, I think. The scope is what I say, it is for clinical trials with medicinal products. It doesn't mean that every trial where a medicinal product is used will within the scope. The objectives of your study will have to be that you are studying for efficacy, safety, or pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamics from a certain specific medicinal product studied in a specific population. That can be healthy volunteers or a patient. The studies can also be national or multinational, just to be clear on that. And if this is the objective of your study, to study this efficacy, safety, or PK/PD things, then there are other things which you have to consider, and that is in the orange box. That first of all, the assignment to this therapeutic strategy, to this IMP, this investigational medical product, is decided in advance and does not fall within normal clinical practice in your in your member state. Also, the decision to prescribe the investigational medicinal product is simultaneously decided with the decision to include the subject in the trial, or diagnostic or monitoring procedures additional to normal clinical practice are applied. So if any of these three are applicable, then your trial falls within the scope of a clinical trial regulation. So for instance, if you are just studying normal clinical practice and then, well, a therapy with product X, this is decided by the treating physician, not because of a clinical trial or whatsoever, but you want to take some blood samples from these patients, and maybe there is a scan made there, then they are exposed to additional diagnostic and monitoring procedures, and then it falls within the scope. So you didn't change their treatment whatsoever, you didn't give them another medicinal product, but you were interested in the efficacy and safety of this medicinal product, and they are exposed to additional procedures, like for instance, blood sampling or an MRI or whatever. So, and sometimes you will do nothing and only administer the product, and you have only minor additional monitoring procedures, for instance, a simple, let's say, a quality of life questionnaire, and then it's also within the scope. So you see several times the wording normal clinical practice in the clinical trial regulation, and you could say everything what is not normal clinical practice and you are interested to study safety and efficacy of the medicinal product is within the scope. Next slide, please. So, and what is not considered normal clinical practice? So as soon as you start randomizing, so for instance, you do have two types of treatments. It's standard of care in hospital A and in another hospital B. But as soon as you start randomizing patients to treatment A or B, then it's already within the clinical trial regulation. Or if you want to blind medication, or you will administer the medicinal product without a marketing authorization, or administer medicinal products to subjects without a clinical indication or a medical need. So for instance, if you do a phase 1 trial with healthy volunteers, and also what I just said, if you have additional or more frequent or increased diagnostic of monitoring procedures, then it's also all within the scope. Next one. And people find it very different always to find out, does my study fall within the scope, yes or no? And sometimes there is a gray area. So we have developed a clinical trial decision tool which you can go through. You have to answer some questions, and then there is an outcome whether it's not within the scope and whether you have to fulfill all the rules of the clinical trial regulation or not. Next one. So just an example of one question where it's been asked, what kind of products are you administering? And if you don't one of these, then you go to the next question, etc., etc. Just an example. Okay, next slide, please. So what I said, there is a guidance on risk proportionate approaches in clinical trials. So if you have decided that, okay, my trial is within the scope, I have to follow the rules of the clinical trial regulation, it is very interesting to see if your clinical trial is qualified as a low intervention clinical trial. And that could be the case if you fulfill all the conditions which are mentioned here on the slide. First of all, the investigational medicinal product has to be authorized. And the investigational medicinal product are used in accordance with the term of the marketing authorization, or it is evidence-based, an evidence-based treatment that could be based on published scientific evidence, or could be based on treatment guidances from your organization of specialists. And in addition, the last one, these additional diagnostic and monitoring procedures should have not more than minimal risk or burden to the safety of the subject. So the risk and burden should be minimal for the trial participants. The medicinal product should be authorized. If not authorized, it should at least be evidence-based. And I think many times within your field that could be the case. And I know that within rare diseases there are not really published treatment guidances, but if you can support that with other information, that could also be accepted as a criteria for low intervention clinical trials. Next one. And there are some adaptations possible which are interested to do so. It's not only for low intervention clinical trials, can also be for a non-low intervention clinical trials if your product is authorized. But one of the interesting things, which is also a large cost in clinical trials, is the IMP management. So the management of the investigational product, the traceability and accountability. Well, if it's a product which is authorized and used on label, you could, for this part, the traceability and accountability, you could use the standard prescription documentation at the pharmacy, so you don't have to have an additional one. The next one. It's also not necessary, this is the next slide. Okay, oh, now it sleeps. Okay, I will tell you, I will continue a little bit because the, okay, thank you. Because also an highly cost is the labeling of the medicinal products. Previously it was the case that as soon as your medicinal product is qualified as an investigational medicinal product, you had to label it, which is expensive. But if it's authorized, your product, and it is not blinded, of course, or there might be other reasons where labeling might be required, but in general, you don't have to do additional labeling for this authorized medicinal products. So I think that that's also an advantage of the new system. Next slide. So another advantage is that if your trial is qualified as a low intervention clinical trial with minimal risk and burden, there is the possibility to have an exemption on the insurance, so on the mandatory damage compensation. So in the Netherlands, you have to have two. You have to have a insurance for your trial participants, and you have to have a liability insurance. The last one should always be there, but a specific trial participant insurance could be exempted if your trial is a low intervention clinical trial. So that's also, I think, interesting to know. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, the EU single portal, just to let you know that this portal is a very complex system where everybody who has a role within the clinical trial or within the authorization procedure of medicinal product has a role. So it is the marketing authorization holder who has an account. It is the Commission, the European Commission, who have an account. It is the EMA, the European Medicine Agency, but it is also the sponsor. It's in green. who has a role in this system. The purple one are the member states who have to register their assessment, their full assessment. All the questions they have will be registered in this system, and you have to respond also in this system. So it's the system where you have to be if you want to do a clinical trial, where you do your submissions, where you answer questions, where you have to register the start of the clinical trial, the end of the clinical trial, the summary of the results, and also it is not within this clinical trial, but all the serious unexpected adverse events have to be administered at registered at the vigilance system. I will not address this here, but it's a full IT system currently. Next one. And as of yesterday, all applications, all initial application has to go through CTIS. So 2 days ago, you could still use the old legislation, which was different per member state, but for now, from today, you have to use CTIS if you have a new application. And if you have substantial modifications from your old application in your old system, you can still use the old system. But new applications have to go through this system. And you can see in the slide, there is an entrance for sponsors, an entrance for authorities, and there is also an entrance for the public. And I've given the link to have a look. Okay, next slide. Well, this system, I already said, it is a very complex system for many, many reasons. One of the primary reasons, I think, is that there are so many roles, and with these roles, there are so many different rights, what you can do and what you can't do in the system. And also with the fact that everything is really regulated with the timelines. The timelines have to take into account all holidays across Europe, and also the transparency rules are part of this system. What should be made public, what should not be made public. So the system is not what it used to be, and recently there were all kinds of publications in the German press to postpone the clinical trial regulation because of all the concerns with this system. There are still big concerns. Everybody is working hard to improve the system, but they have to introduce a new complexity. I would like to say more positive words about the system, but it is really a concern. So I wanted to share it with you, that you do know it, that you're not surprised when you start. Next slide, please. And for this reason, we have made a quick guide to sponsors, especially to academic sponsors, to find your way. There is a lot of information out there, how to start with this new system, what things you have to take into consideration. And this is the first version to kind of roadmap. You could use it for sponsors because I think there is a lot of information out there, but it's not always easy to find. And we hope with this quick guide, it's easier to find, and it's published on Eulerlex volume 10. It's on the bottom of this slide. Next one. And we also have on our own website at the CCMO a kind of roadmap from start to finish, which takes you through all the processes to submit a clinical trial, and then give you some context with respect to legislation, type of documents which you have to submit, and what to take into account. Yeah, just to inform you. Next slide. Okay, just tick. Sorry. And I think, I think it's probably already your experience that if you want to do a clinical trial nowadays, or even the last years, it's not something you do apart, easy to do next to your regular work. it's a job on sich, and especially with this new system, although it has many advantages because of the coordinated assessment, this one place, but you really have to be organized before you even start submitting your clinical trial. And this is something I really want to emphasize, and I hope the quick guide will be of any help for this. Yeah, next one. And this is it for now. Questions, you can always ask questions. I've put a link on our website for the clinical trials, but we also have guidance and standards for clinical investigations with medical devices and also for in vitro diagnostica. So this was just the first glimpse of the clinical trial regulation. The risk proportionate approaches, which you can see in the other regulations as well, but I only focus now on the medicinal products. And thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'm very much willing to answer them. Thank you.
Well, Monique, thank you very much for this this talk about the clinical trial regulations. I assume that there are many questions. At least I have a lot of questions. But first, I would like to start with one question. Is it correct that this applies to the trials you perform involving medicinal products? So if we compare two different types of surgery and we randomize it, this does not apply to it, does it?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And my second question was that if you have a national trial, are you obliged to use the CTIS as well? So if you want to do it in your country alone, do you also have to use this system?
Yeah. So if it's a national trial studying a medicinal product and fulfilling the criteria, I have to, what I try to explain. But yes, it is for national, multinational, conducted in the European Union. It's also for academic trials as well as for commercial trials. That doesn't make any difference. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I would like to invite everybody to join us in the discussion. I'm not sure if I can see where we can have the questions, but Martin is raising his hand. So please,
yeah,
Martin.
I didn't see a chat also. Maybe we have to go by, I don't know how you can raise a hand in this GoToWebinar meeting. I'm not familiar with that. Maybe, but then I just start with asking Anna. So Anna, this trial has started already, and how many patients have you included so far? I didn't really get that.
Well, today we've included our 11th patient,
Okay.
and we have a goal of 110 patients. So we're 10%. Yeah.
And how did you define how deep you inject this steroids into the lesion?
We did not define that in the protocol. We just defined that you have to inject 1 milliliter of quinacort into 4 quadrants of the esophagus where the stenosis is, but it's not defined how deep it needs to be injected. Maybe John has, I see John is there. Maybe you have some insights about that?
Well, it's a standard very teeth injection needle you use, which is about 2 millimeters long. So that's the maximum you can go in depth. Usually that's what you use. You put it in about another 90 degrees, so a bit obliquely. So you see a nice submucosal quartal.
Okay. When we inject, we add some methylene blue also to it to make sure we know where the dye goes or the medicine goes. Do you also do this, or?
No.
We don't do that.
Okay.
But today we could see quite clearly where the medicinal product was because it's really white, and yeah, you can see where you inject and you can see where it is at that moment.
And I didn't really, maybe I didn't get it. The inclusion criteria, is it just the recurrent stricture, or how often do you have to dilate before? Is this, can you do from the start?
Yeah. I indeed didn't tell the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the patients that are included, they must have a type C esophageal atresia, and they need to be above the age of 3 months or 3 months old, and it needs to be their third dilatation. So only the third one we're including in the trial, so that everybody's at the same time point. And we chose the third one because we hope to prevent a refractory stricture, which sometimes is defined as 5 dilations or more. So that's why we chose for the third one.
And another question, this 750 euro case payment, when do you pay? When they completed the full data set? Because that was an obstacle we faced in the MOOC-FIRE trial. You have a lot of, when you start off, you have a lot of enthusiastic colleagues, and then some of them are asking for money, but you need to make sure they're submitting the data set also. And that is a big obstacle for a lot of centers. They participate, but you can only pay them when the data is submitted. Do you also have this protocol? How do you deal with that?
We don't have this written in the protocol, and it's something that's kind of an ongoing discussion, and we make we actually make different agreements with different centers, because some are in a bit more of a hurry to receive the 750 euros. So actually only recently we've included, we ended the follow-up period for the first 2 patients abroad. So that's something I wanted to discuss with Professor Weine and John, if we were able to pay them already or later on. And well, they didn't ask for it yet, but maybe after this webinar they will.
Don't pay up front, but these were my questions for now.
Yeah, I have a question for Monique still. I was wondering, you said that you had to apply to the portal, but are there penalties involved because you have to start within the portal, you have to end the study, etc., etc.? But what happens if you won't do it?
Well, there are penalties that differ between member states, but our national legislation has been adjusted with respect to this penalties, or I don't know the English word of it. You can even go to jail, I think. Anyway, if your trial is subject to the clinical trial regulation, and you start a clinical trial without an authorization, or you neglect certain obligations you have with respect to notification or with respect to submission of trial results, you could have receive a fine, a penalty, depending on the seriousness of the things you did or not did. So.
Okay. And why is the timeline so strict in the regulation? Do you know that?
Yeah, I really don't know. I really don't know why the timelines for the sponsor are so much shorter compared to the regulators. We do have a little bit more time. We do find it some challenging as well. I really don't know what they were thinking. I'm so sorry. It is for a commercial sponsor, they can organize themselves and it's manageable. But for academic, it's really a challenge. I have to say that there is a simplification with respect to resubmission. So if your application is lapsed because you didn't manage the timelines, the 12 days, for instance, then there is a rather easy button in the system for a resubmission. Nevertheless, the cost for the assessment will increase, because there are fees for the different phases which you have to pay. In the Netherlands, we do have a reduced fee for academic trials, and in Denmark you don't have to pay at all, but it is different between member states. Yeah.
And what are the costs involved grossly? Is that known?
Yeah, in the Netherlands it's published on our website, and for the other member states I do not know. You have to find out per member state. But even though it is a central application, but suppose 3 member states are participating and they all ask a fee, then it is 3 times the fee. It's not just the fee for only the member state who is in the lead. And there's a fee for part 1, so the central part, which we do together with the member states. There's a fee for the national documents, and there's a fee for a substantial modification, yeah, etc. You can find the fees in the Netherlands on our website. Yeah. So
it doesn't seem to be simple to perform these kinds of studies.
yeah.
René,
Well,
you were mentioning some questions. Sorry.
Yes, first I have to congratulate Omid and Anne Fleur that with so many hurdles, you're still so enthusiastic. That's amazing. So I have, that's very great. And what I see for the both of you, the time you have expanded, but you still are fanatic to reach the different goal. And I think if we have a third center who has also these kind of experience with a trial in pediatric surgery, maybe it's interesting to combine this for an experience article.
That would be great, I think. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore we maybe also can use some information of Monique. And Monique, I have two questions for you. What do you call a sponsor?
well, the sponsor is that can be an person, just an individual, can be a sponsor, it can be an organization. It can
somebody
be,
who pays, or is that the principal investigator?
No. This is somebody who is responsible for the initiation and the conduct of the clinical trial.
So it's a kind of principal investigator.
Well, the sponsor and the principal investigator could be the same, but in the Netherlands, most of the times, if we are talking about, let's say, academic centers, then the board of the directors of this academic center is the sponsor, where the principal investigator is appointed.
Okay.
And then you have the investigator. So the sponsor and the investigator all have both different roles and responsibilities. It could be, in theory, the same person, but that's more an exception, I think.
And then I have a second question. Of course, we have to deal with rare diseases, and some of the RCTs we are working with is also, for example, an RCT from initiated from or the UK or the States. And if we want with European centers to participate, do we still have to do it also then to put this in the RCT? Is it even possible or not?
Yes, well, if the sponsor is in the US or wherever he is in the world, that doesn't matter. This can be everywhere. The only thing is that if you want to do a clinical trial in the European Union and the sponsor is not located in one of the member states in the European Union, you have to have a legal representative of the sponsor. That can also be one person. That can be rather simple, to be honest, which have an agreement with the sponsor. And then there are all kinds of arrangements with respect to responsibilities and who is doing what. But for the per member state, you have to apply, not per member state, you have to apply in the clinical trial information system for an authorization of this clinical trial to be conducted in country ABC in the European Union. So worldwide is still possible. We see that many often, especially in rare diseases. We assess a lot of trials as the CCMO in rare diseases, and that are almost trials with third countries, so US, Australia, Canada, and some member states in the European Union. Yeah, but you have to arrange something. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to say, sorry. I just in addition that we are always open if the study will be performed in the Netherlands. We are always open to have a meeting to discuss what is the best way forward to submit your application. Not really an assessment, but to assist you in how to approach the system, which documents, and so we are really open to give advice on that. So that's what I wanted to share with you on a national
That only
level.
applies to the Dutch, I guess, or not?
Well, we're thinking of from a European perspective. There is also a group with all the competent authorities to set up something on an EU level as well, a more regulatory advice apart from the scientific advices which we already have. Yeah, but this, yeah, we hope to arrange it, but there are some political things anyway. So, but you can always approach CCMO. Yeah.
Okay. I have another question for Omid, because he said to me something very interesting, that he that you also invite people to initiate sub-studies to perform it within the construct of your trial. But how is the paperwork? Because what I noticed from your presentation is that it takes a long time, but what happens with the paperwork? Do you have to do that all over again, or can you just shove it in and have the shortcut?
Yeah, well, a sub-study is, yeah, the problem is, what do we consider a sub-study? That's but if you are using the same population and it's related more or less to the primary objective, it can be still part of this whole package, and it will be a substantial modification, I would say. Yeah, but
Maybe
if you have a sub,
yeah, Monique, I just wanted to add, because that's exactly the way we did it. So we had like an extended protocol version for everybody who wanted to participate in the sub-studies. So, and like a contracted one for the ones who wanted to stay just stuck with the main study. So what I mentioned is that through this, we had it's the same cohort that we are investigating. We just offer the network to some degree for scientific collaborations. And we as the PIs, I think Martin was involved in even more sub-studies than I was. So we are even willing to actively participate in those constructs as well. And in our case, it's been a good motivation for the centers, to be honest.
Yeah, what you yeah, I'm sub-studies is always in Europe. Oh, there's always a lot of discussion because when it's afraid that somebody gives the title sub-study and it is a completely new clinical trial. But we do see more often that there is more a kind of platform for doing clinical trials. So this is the basic with a master trial, and within this platform concept, there could be several, yeah, I will call it sub-arms or domains or sub-protocols, or how you want to call it, within those construct of a platform trial. And that's most of the time just you start with one initial submission explaining the mother, the master protocol with one arm, and then within this concept you can add sub-protocols if it's still within more or less the same hypothesis or primary objective. And that is easier to continue and to progress most of the times. Yeah.
Martin, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Omid. I think sub-studies are really important because people ask, what is my share, right? So some people don't like just to add 1 or 2 patients. There's a lot of pain for everybody. And some of the juniors, they're very interested to do some research by themselves. So if you add a sub-study, you motivate a lot of people to actually participate in the main trial. So I think sub-studies is a nice teaser.
Can I maybe ask something in addition? What do you have an example of one of your sub-studies? I didn't actually know that was possible within a bigger trial.
Maybe I can just add it. We had some sub-trials. For example, we are working on mucus fistula repeating. So we are having stool before surgery, before we put back the ostomy. And there were some investigations on, for example, microbiome in those. So you see, it's quite simple to add something that doesn't add any additional trauma to the patients, and we're still working with all those samples that we already have. So that's the most simple thing about it, because something that we had to stick with within our whole protocol is that we that we said during all ethics approval that we had, that we won't add any additional harm or trauma to the patients. And still we have a lot of samples stuck in our banks, biobanks and labs. And that's one of the main things that we offer the networks for. And it's really working well, to be honest.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh yeah, just to add, sorry, okay, this might be something different because you want to more or less have secondary use of data or secondary use of sampling and samples which you already have in a biobank. That's different legislation, to be honest. Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
I think can I just add one last thing, bro? What's quite interesting for me, because we're thinking when Martin and I wrote the first grant application back then, and I think Martin mentioned it as well, the German Research Foundation that we're working with is the most important scientific organization in Germany to get a grant from. But the quite interesting thing is we are talking about European collaborations, and that was an obstacle because we are only allowed to have less than 20% of patients outside from Germany. So even though we have Austria and the Netherlands, we see that those national research organizations still are some obstacles for our European collaboration. So I would be happy to see more options in the future through the ERNs to have grants that are really focusing on the European collaborations, especially in pediatric surgery, where we need those academic centers to participate in those studies with those rare diseases, because that's a major problem.
So you mean that if you initiate from Germany, that only 20% of the participants can be from abroad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
That's in fact a big problem, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's German regulation, I guess. It's probably not European.
But you know, this is why that's why the money comes from. I think the German Research Foundation wants to make sure that they're funding like national projects, which would have some touch of internationality, but they don't want to fund a EU project, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that could be a burden, a problem, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Is there someone else who has a question? I don't see anything in the chat. So I think we're exactly on time. It's 5:30. So I would like to thank everybody, every speakers, Omid, Anna Fleur, and Monique. Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to thank Martin very much for co-hosting this. I would also thank Carlos, who you can see probably in the part of your screen, who did a lot of organization. So thank you very much for all the help. And I would like to thank all the participants in this first ERNICA webinar. And of course, also a big thanks to Renee to facilitate this. And hopefully we can continue with this. I think we have one more slide because this was the first of 3 webinars we're organizing. And hopefully Carlos can show you the dates, because there will be another 2 additional webinars. And I think they will all be before we go to Madrid. But I don't know exactly the dates by head. So I'm really relying on Carlos now.
Do you see it?
And also, just put them in the chat. That's also fine.
Yeah. Okay. No, we don't see them, but I think that the 8th of March would be the first one, but I'm not sure. But we'll make sure that we distribute the dates.
8th of March. It's about quality of life, and 15th of March. It's about translational research.
Yeah.
You will all get some information who the speakers are and who will monitor the webinar, and it will be also on the website of ERNICA. And in Madrid, we will evaluate these 3 webinars. Is it a good thing or it's useless or not? But for me, this at least was very inspiring to these talks. And for clinical trials, we have still a lot of things to do.
Yeah, and I would like to add, as member of the scientific committee, that if any one of you have a great idea, we would like to see that prosecuted, just inform me or Renee. So if you have a good idea on how we can collaborate better within the ERNICA network, I'm really looking forward to those answers.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. I wish you a very pleasant night and hope to see you all on the 8th of March or in Madrid at the end of March.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.